And away we go. It is another nightcap right here on BearcatJournal.com, brought to you, as always, by our good friends at Galactic Fried Chicken. Visit www.galacticfriedchicken.com to download the app. Everything Android, iPhone, and all things Galactic. The patio is open. The chicken sandwich is back. Summer is in full swing at Galactic Fried Chicken. So make sure you get down there, and when you place your order, tell them to pump it up and get yourself 15% off. All right, Aaron, kind of a busy day in the college sports world. Not necessarily directly on the Bearcats front, but
things that affect them.
A couple changes that are going to affect the sport pretty significantly over the next couple years at least, because one of the changes is only a 2-year kind of trial run. But we'll get to that on the recruiting front. The first one being the elimination of divisions as a requirement for having a conference championship game. So this doesn't, what the NCAA has done is they had a rule. You had to have 12 teams, you had to have divisions, and then the divisions met for a conference championship. That was kind of how the structure was built in the last round of when this was looked at as a rule for the NCAA. And then, like, if you were the AAC that only had 11 teams, then you had to apply for a waiver. If that waiver was granted, then you could have a championship game without 12 teams and divisions. They have finally come to their senses on this. And basically now teams or conferences have the basically free reign to determine who plays in their championship game. They get to set the criteria now instead of the NCAA setting the criteria.
So I appreciate that rule, that you don't have to have division winners, because sometimes you had teams that had better records underneath the team with the best record in the same division that weren't meeting for a conference championship. And that seemed silly.
Of course. What's interesting is the way that this is played out, specifically in the Big Ten and the SEC, as you had the Big Ten East that had Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, and you had the SEC West that had Alabama, Auburn, LSU, now Texas A&M, kind of battling amongst each other for who got the spot in the conference championship game.
Right.
And then when you got in the conference championship game, like the Big Ten had to play maybe a Wisconsin, but they're really, or in Iowa, but those teams weren't nearly as good as the teams that were in the Big Ten East.
Correct.
So this is going to be really interesting in those two conferences, because I think those two conferences kind of like how this is set up, because the regular season basically allows them to determine who's going to be the champion from that power division. And then they go into the championship game. They run through whoever from the weaker division is there, and then they get their spot in the college football playoff, right? Like, that's been kind of the thought process for those conferences.
It's also how it's played out.
Yeah, I mean, Georgia being an exception this year, and there have been a couple exceptions, but for the most part, like, that's been how things have worked for those two conferences. The Pac-12 has already said they are going to play the conference championship game with the two teams with the best winning percentage in conference. The ACC is expected to follow.
Let us know when we're supposed to care about the Pac-12.
Right, but they were the first one. They were the first one to say they were going to do this. Well, if Lincoln Riley gets USC going again, and you have USC and Oregon operating at high levels, they'll be back at least in the conversation. Not that. Well, I mean, if one of those teams with their pedigree go 12-0 and then win the conference championship, they're going to be in the mix.
It's just been
for a championship.
It's been a long time since the Pac-12 has been relevant.
Right. But Lincoln Riley at USC kind of alters that. And Oregon's been right in the realm of relevant, but the Pac-12 has been so bad
that Oregon's just
it
been
kind of
head
didn't
and
matter.
shoulders, right? The head and shoulders above the rest.
And now you've got Utah that's making a little bit of a charge.
Yeah.
So they could be interesting. The Pac-12 could be interesting again, but it's been a while. You're right. The ACC, not much different. Like,
it's just been Clemson running away with everything.
Yeah, it has been Clemson that has dominated their division and walked through the conference, then complete trash in the other division.
Yeah.
So it makes sense for the ACC to get rid of it also, much like the Pac-12, as soon as possible, because you're trying to give your teams the best chance to get into the playoff.
I guess the only issue that I have with any of this rule is I still think that there should be a minimum requirement of teams in your conference. Otherwise, you may see teams just start to boot the trash.
That's never going to happen.
No?
No.
Well, I don't know.
Too much power, too much.
There's been everything that ESPN keeps talking about, or any of the talking heads for that matter, is that you're going to see a super, basically 64 teams at some point walking away from the NCAA and essentially having their own college football.
Aaron,
I hope it never happens.
It's such a lazy narrative by ESPN because you know what the NCAA is? The governing body for those schools. They are the NCAA. They're going to break away from themselves. They already have, those conferences already have full autonomy, right? It's not the Power Five, it's the Autonomous Five. If you look in the record book or the rule books or whatever the NCAA has.
Bylaws.
What are they walking away from? Like, I think it's just a lazy narrative that people like to talk about. If they wanted to change something, they could change everything that exists already on the books, such as changing the requirement to play a conference championship game against your two divisions. Like, well, they're not breaking away from the NCAA. They might restructure like what they're doing, but the NCAA is always going to be the NCAA. The other thing I love about that, you know how much money the NCAA gets from the college football playoff?
I don't.
Nothing. It's not an NCAA tournament. Notice it's not called the NCAA tournament. It's called the college football playoff, and there's no mention of the NCAA.
Because it's run by ESPN?
Because it's run by the colleges. They don't want the NCAA to have any connection to that money. The NCAA has no juice in college football. It never has. It never will. So, like, this constant ESPN talking point of they're going to break away. Break away from what? Themselves?
I mean, it makes for good talking points in, the doldrums of May and July and those months where nothing is really happening.
Right.
So.
I get that part. Like, you have to have content, right? Like, as a content guy, I understand.
Right.
We go through this every day. What is our content for today?
Yep.
But they're not breaking away.
I guess I just want to see a minimum requirement of 12 teams. I think that would be the only thing that I would asterisk. I think you have to have some type of minimum for these conferences because I don't want to see somebody with a higher percentage chance because you have less teams.
The number of teams are going up, not down. Vanderbilt's never getting kicked out of the SEC. Like, it's not happening. Like, it's just not how it works. What's the last team to get kicked out of a conference? I think was Temple was kicked out of the Big East because their football had cratered and they were drawing like 4,000 people. It looked like the stands at a Miami Redhawks game.
UConn essentially took themselves out.
UConn forfeited on football. They folded.
They punted on football.
they got 9-2 in the hole for like the 18th time in a row, and they were like, "Look, man, I'm gonna go play Omaha. I'm going to play high-low Omaha basketball because the no limit hold'em thing isn't working.
Wasn't it right after doing the locker room update as well?
Oh,
like
yeah. Like they spent a bunch of money on football.
Millions.
Yeah.
And they're like, we're just not good at this.
We're out. So I think it's good ultimately because I think imagine how much better that conference championship weekend will be when we truly get the two best teams from each conference playing for the championship. And, and it like Ohio State, Penn State, if they were top 5 in the country.
For the second time, since traditionally they don't end up playing.
Well, now you're going to see the adjustment is going to be how are the schedules made when you do this. A lot of the talk has been, and I'm sure we'll get into this is like 101, this nightcap 101 on what has happened today. I'm sure Dave will take us into the 400 level tomorrow night on the BCJ podcast because Dave's going to have a lot of thoughts on this. But I just think that a conference championship week could be incredible if you truly get all the best top of the conferences having their two best teams playing, with a lot of them having playoff ramifications and implications. Like, how exciting was Baylor and Oklahoma State last year?
Absolutely. So many Bearcats fans tuned in to watch because of the ramifications it was going to have for us.
And the game was decided by this. 3 inches. The ball extends 3 more inches, and there's a pretty good chance Cincinnati doesn't play Alabama in the college football playoff.
Yep.
So,
which we've had heartbreak to go the other way when Texas wins on a field goal, and
that shouldn't have happened. But I digress.
Right. Wasn't trying to go all the way down that rabbit hole.
I digress. The other one, for 2 years. This is a 2-year trial period on this particular change. So there's for 10 years or so. Most of the time I've been doing this, there's been a 25 player limit on recruiting classes. And then 2 years ago, I think, they added transfers into that.
For football, obviously.
For football, yes. You can only add 25 players to your roster before today via high school and transfer. You could only add 25 guys. So what you were seeing were teams that were getting hit really hard by the transfer portal. Most of the time, teams that had lost their head coach had gone in a different direction, and they lose 30, 40 scholarship players, and then they can only add 25. So now, they weren't even allowed to get to the 85 player limit. So they were playing with 70, 72, 75 guys. So this will now allow the 25 is out, the 85 stays. So your roster is still, hard capped at 85 scholarship players, but you no longer are tied to only being able to add 25 people onto your roster. I think this is really interesting because what used to happen, and this was a big thing in the SEC, and that's why it became a hard and fast 25 number, is that even when there was a limit of 25, SEC schools were signing 30, 35 players. And then, academics, kid's out for academics, or, and it was kind of like a war of attrition from signing day until the day that they enrolled.
Just kind of Lord of the Flies rules where Darwinism takes over. Figure it out yourselves, kids.
Well, but when you think about that, what was happening was you had 10, 15 schools doing this. So there were 100 kids that are, if you're being recruited to the SEC, you're one of the higher level kids. Yeah. You've got 100 kids that are left kind of into the abyss, or didn't really get to go through a proper recruiting cycle because of it.
Well,
and then they're scrambling at the end.
What have we seen since the transfer portal really took off? Is you have so many kids sitting out now. Again, kind of, I imagine there's kids that would have fallen into this particular rule exception where you have teams that could have brought more guys on board, but and I would imagine that you also, with COVID, super seniors sticking around, finishing out last year, this next year. Cincinnati lost, I think, 30 some odd seniors. And if they were only allowed to bring in 25, this makes perfect sense.
Kind of. Unless we see teams abusing it again, which they will, because that's what happens when the rules are changed, as everybody looks for loopholes and ways to abuse it.
So
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just make it to where you cannot have any more offers out there than you have holes.
Offers are meaningless. They don't mean any like that.
Or make it to where you have X amount over how many scholarships you have to where you can't do this. Once you hit your amount of commits, you can't continue to accept 5 more, 10 more commits.
But commits aren't official. Commits aren't binding. And that's where the loophole is, right? And if you compare it to the 85, well, then guess what's going to happen? They're just going to start cutting guys, right?
Yeah.
They're going to start cutting the back end of the roster. Okay? You had your chance. It's been 2 years. You've gone from redshirt freshman to freshman. You're going into your 3rd year on campus, and you haven't cracked the 2 deep. You're out. And now we're adding 40 new guys. Is that good for the sport?
Maybe. And I say this because I go back to how many guys didn't have a home last year.
There's 1,000 guys that don't have a home right now.
That's kind of what I'm getting at, though.
More of them are going to, my point is, more of them are going to be in the portal because schools are just going to start cutting players at the back of their roster. And where do those players go, Aaron?
Either
to the portal.
Either another school, D2, D3. Maybe college isn't for them at that point. Maybe they go back home. I mean, I don't know. Do you have a solution?
I just don't know that completely eliminate. I think here's what I like. You get the 25, okay? 25 remains the number. And then you get 1-for-1 your attrition after 25. 1 out, 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, 1 out, 1 in, and you still keep the 85 limit. So that way you're not having people manipulate this as I fear that it's going to potentially happen. Mainly I fear that because the 25 was put in place for a reason, and it was to curtail what was happening at the time as teams were abusing what they are doing in recruiting. What changes this whole scenario, what changes the equation is the portal. Because I don't think, and I've had this conversation with a couple of people I know that work in recruiting and personnel around the country. Do you really want 35, 40 freshmen on your roster? Hell no. Your roster's 85, right? And then you're going to have redshirt freshmen that didn't play the previous year, or they played 4 games. So you're going to have, 50, 55, 60 kids on your roster that are either freshmen or redshirt freshmen? That is not how you win college football games, right? It's not how you win college football games.
Even with the 1 out, 1 in and all of that, I think you'd still see people getting cut. And essentially,
you see people getting cut now. I don't know how you're going to eliminate that completely. I just think in this iteration, it is incentivized, right? Because of the transfer portal, the teams at the top of the food chain are just going to say, oh, well, we can get rid of these 15 kids that haven't done anything, and they're in year 3 and haven't done anything.
Right.
Those 15 kids are out. Now we've got 40 spots. Like I just, we had 5 guys, 7 guys leave early for the NFL. We just cut 15 guys, and we had 20 seniors. Now we can take our 2025 high school kids and completely redo our roster with the additional 12 transfer spots that we just opened up to go pick successful kids from lower major programs or from other, high level teams in your own conference, because the conference to conference stuff is
I don't know, maybe
rampant right now.
Maybe you fix that to where, like, if a kid decides that football, like if he's getting cut or being told not to be there anymore, or whatever the case may be, they still have to honor his 4-year scholarship. Like, dig your hip.
A 1-year deal, bro.
And that's stupid too. Maybe that's the entire problem here. That's the entire problem here.
You know why it's like that? Because that's how the schools want it.
Well, I don't know. I'm very curious to see how this conversation goes with you and Dave tomorrow night, as you are going to be touching on plenty of this. We're already at 21 minutes here.
Yeah.
But I'm really happy that tomorrow is going to be a day that I'll be producing for you. And
Dave and I are going to go on. We'll do an hour on this.
It's going to be hard to stay out of the conversation, but I'm very curious to hear you guys' takes on it.
All right. We'll see you tomorrow night. Back here on the Nightcap. Also on the Holy Grail BCJ podcast. Thanks for tuning in. That was 101 on the new rules. We'll get into the advanced class tomorrow night. I'm Chad Brendel. He's Aaron Smith. It's the Nightcap, brought to you by Galactic Fried Chicken, right here on BearcatJournal.com.
See ya!